Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. The title of this broadcast is World Watchers. The program is number 767, and it is August the 18th, 1986. Just to begin the program with two Reaganisms of the week, because there are so many, we'll never catch up on them. One, in a radio speech July 26th, just about a month ago, the president said, quote, "When we came into office on a hot summer day, well, we didn't come into office on a hot summer day. The economy had about as much energy as a hound dog on a hot summer day." You might remember inauguration is January the 21st, 1981. Also at a high school commencement in New Jersey, he said there are advantages of being president. The day after I was elected, I had my high school grades classified top secret. Well, no wonder he did if he didn't know whether it was warm or cold on the hot summer's day when he came into office. Now, I'm going to put off for a few weeks a lot of material. It would take an hour to list the important things that I have to put off, but I will be continuing on the Sikhs in their moving large numbers of them to Ecuador, their relationship to drugs in Afghanistan, the CIA, the Pakistan, and the Mossad. I'm going to do a great deal on Anita Costello, Nancy Reagan's not drug running, but weapon smuggling into Paraguay. The weapons and translator for people sending 50,000 rounds of .22. That's a typical assassination weapon, so you could kill 50,000 people with what was shipped on the boat just that particular time when they were apprehended. I also want to do quite a bit on the Beverly Hills connections of Hugh Skinner, the manager of Van Cleef and Arpels, and his murder, Roy Cohn and his relationship to that Beverly Hills milieu, Larry Flint's mystery illness, Althea Flint's AIDS, Ajah, who now allegedly has TB and the links of TB to AIDS, and Roy Cohn and his AIDS, and of course Roy Cohn from Lionel Train Company as well as Western Goals, mentioned throughout the Permadex document as part of the team that killed John Kennedy. Also, we'll get into the fourth shuttle and the transfer of the shuttle to the military, the Pope coming to Carmel, the Tom Papa's CIA Agnew connections to Watergate and William Rehnquist, the Chernobyl accident, which was man-made and I believe was sabotage, a lot on advanced genetic sciences, and they've been given up the idea of ever coming to Monterey County. They were chased out. And more on the CHRISTIC Institute and the lawsuit that involves some very famous and infamous people like Theodore Shackley and John Singlaub, the who's who of the CIA, and the articles that have been coming out since that are very important. So there's a lot of material that I hate to pass up, but I will give you the address to the CHRISTIC Institute that is handling this lawsuit. Very important. It's run by Daniel P. Sheehan, Sheehan. The CHRISTIC Institute is 1324 North Capitol Street, Washington, D.C., 20002. And you can send a contribution or ask for literature, any amount that you want, or up to 25, and then you go on up. You can give what you want. But Mr. Daniel Sheehan refers to this lawsuit that they have against these top CIA people and Contras and Somoza Army teams and assassination teams and agent provocateurs. He compares it similar to the Watergate, and he said if the suit goes through their project, it could lead to the impeachment of the Reagan administration officials for criminal activities. Well, that would have happened with Lyndon Johnson if we had investigated the Kennedy assassination. It would have happened with a real impeachment of Richard Nixon and the team around him if we had followed it through. I don't know where these big lawsuits ever end. It's similar to the ACLU versus Western Goals in Los Angeles that has been silenced for 2 years. I hope they can proceed with it, but they really have a lot of biggies. And it is true that if this were done properly and the lawsuit had enough money, and you can't compete with the unlimited money of the Defense Department and the CIA, but I won't say never, it could actually lead to the impeachment of the Reagan administration and get rid of William Casey and those people that have been there since the OSS days that have gotten it into so much trouble. You might have read in the newspaper today about the members of the death squad, 3 members of the El Salvadorian death squad, known to kill over 300 people just recently, came to Washington, D.C. to get some more training. And they are trained in the United States as well as elsewhere, and then they're sent back to kill. But I do want to do the entire evening just on William Rehnquist. The appointment of him as a justice of the Supreme Court was horrendous, but now Ronald Reagan has nominated him to be Chief Justice, and I want to deal entirely with that matter and some very important items. And I hope maybe you'll make copies of these tapes and make notes about this, or send for the not the transcript, but the printed sheet with the bibliography sources, and write letters in the next 3 weeks. Congress has a vacation for 3 weeks. This is your chance to participate and jump into the action. When I jumped into the action and confronted the power of Roman Haas or I.G. Farben or the Swedish and the Belgium money and behind advanced genetic sciences, they got a wallop in Monterey County and closed camp. And even now in California, there's a question about their using the altered virus, the bacteria, to put on plants, the ice minus they call it, but it's much more dangerous. And they did leave this area with their head down between their legs, and now they're being chased out of other areas. And there are about 20 important articles on that subject just this past week. But we made history in Monterey by kicking them out of Monterey and calling attention to the world to the huge corporation and the possibilities that it could portend. Now, William Rehnquist was the Justice Department's chief legal advisor from 1969 to 1971, and that was the time period preceding the Watergate arrests. The Watergate crimes that followed after the arrest as of June 72 pertained to the things that were happening and the scandals that were happening when William Rehnquist was the advisor over John Mitchell, or Robert Mardian, the lover of the Gestapo photographs in the archives, or G. Gordon Liddy with his Gestapo affiliations and love of the actual German Gestapo, and E. Howard Hunt and James McCord and Charles Colson and so forth. He was the Justice Department's chief legal advisor, and several weeks ago I ran down what was happening in this country in 1970 when Richard Nixon decided in 1971 to give the chemical and biological warfare area at Fort Detrick to Litton Industries, and it included Kent State, and I listed for about 15 minutes the various activities. If you have that sheet, if you don't have, write to me, and I'll send it to you. What was happening when Rehnquist was the legal advisor of the Justice Department for the Watergate people that got into so much trouble. Now, in the fall of 1971, October 18th, 1971, Louis Tackwood had a press conference, and this is very important because Rehnquist was there, for, as I say, through the time period of 1969 to 71. So what Louis Tackwood was talking about at his press conference, that was the basis for my article, my first published article, Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped? What he was talking about was plans that were made when William Rehnquist was a legal advisor to the Justice Department, and that is very important, and those are the papers that should be made available. Louis Tackwood had worked for the Los Angeles Police Department for 9 years. He was an agent provocateur. He was assigned to a special squad composed of police and federal agents, and they were to hire radicals and provocateurs for the Republican National Convention in San Diego. This CHRISTIC Institute, the suit that they have, is about agent provocateurs bombing the American embassy in Costa Rica and blaming Nicaragua and creating violence as an excuse to overthrow the government in Nicaragua. It's the identical thing continuing on in 1964. This was 1971. Squad 19 was coordinated as a contingency plan under the joint direction of the FBI, the National FBI, the CCS, the Criminal Conspiracy Section of the Police Department, and directions of the operations came under Daniel Mahoney of CCS and a Mr. Essard Birch of the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover. The squad's intention was to create a situation at the convention which would permit the president to invoke special emergency powers, leading to the arrest of political activists. And throughout the country, the squad planned to use explosives inside the convention hall to kill prominent politicians and journalists attending the convention. Again, the lawsuit of the CHRISTIC Institute is about blowing up a group of journalists and killing 3 of them, 2 who survived, and aiming to get rid of these particular people that were opposing the operations of the Contras and create an excuse for more money for the Contras. So what they were planning in 71 and what they did before and after, the similarities are there because it's the same people who really never have left power. The squad, as I say, would use explosives and blow up journalists and politicians. Louis Tackwood realized that the small fry in San Diego, the Lee Harvey Oswalds, would be killed. He'd never get out alive. Agents were to be hired to infiltrate groups planning demonstrations against the war and against Nixon and Agnew. And at the same time, the explosives go off inside the convention hall. There would simultaneously be riots in the streets, just as the same people who killed John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy planned riots when Martin Luther King was killed. And that was the excuse to clamp down on violent black activists, for one thing, and escalate mind control and brain surgery and isolate the blacks for violence because of violence at that particular time. Tackwood said the goal was a total police state, and after martial law, they were figuring out a way to get Nixon. He was approached in September 71. He held his press conference October 18th to tell about Squad 19, and you can look that up. It was in the Washington Post, written by Leroy Aarons, Los Angeles Times, the LA Free Press, the New York Times. In 1971, those papers were available, and I think that the congressional committees, the Congress, is going to have a full vote on the Rehnquist nomination to be Chief Justice. So number one, what I'm saying is write a letter and ask for the Louis Tackwood allegations and what Rehnquist did about them. You can go to the library and copy his press conferences. All of that is indexed in the library, and you can photocopy it and ask what William Rehnquist did know about that. He left in 1971 then to be appointed as a justice of the Supreme Court, but the plans that were being made were made while he was still working as a legal advisor, chief advisor for the Justice Department. The excuse for all of this was that there were security leaks out of the Pentagon Papers, and Egil Crow was to plug the leaks. As Howard Hunt of the CIA was brought into the White House, G. Gordon Liddy of the FBI and a special prosecutor from upstate New York was brought into the White House, and this committee was working not only on the Pentagon Papers, but the Chappaquiddick story in case Ted Kennedy would win the nomination or to keep him from getting it, and they were interfering with the elections. So the allegations of Louis Tackwood involved activity that was being planned in the fall of 71, espionage squad that involved Herbert Kalmbach in California, martial law plans, emergency contingency unit, the use of the police force in Miami working along with the FBI and also in San Diego before the convention was switched to Miami. That happened a little later in the spring of 72. The work of the Los Angeles Police Department with the National Intelligence and the State Intelligence, all linked nationally to the police in each individual state and in Washington. The conspiracies would be up and down the coast. It involved Houston, Texas headquarters, Dallas to spread around, and public relations offices, and the hiring of radicals and provocateurs. The fund that was earmarked for the project was $10 million. The contact men were Martin and White, who later turned out Martin and White were the aliases given of James McCord and E. Howard Hunt when they signed in, were arrested at the time of Watergate. And the overall plan was, after martial law, to get Nixon and blame the radicals. Now, that was in 1971 that this was printed in all the newspapers. And at that time that the plans were being made, Rehnquist, as I say, had this job as chief legal advisor for the Justice Department. Now, Robert Gilmore from the Houston Post wrote an article which I saw similar to other people have written on the fact that the president does not have the right to name and decide on the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The article from the Post says the Senate should act as a full partner in naming the justices, not just the Senate judiciary. And Robert Gilmore says this: the Senate, if they have an idea of the way they're going to vote the Supreme Court later on, the way they want to keep homosexuals in the sodomy case in the minds of people, follow the nominations of Antonio Scalia and William Rehnquist, and you get an idea of what is happening. Both nominees believe that the Supreme Court must always defer to the political processes, whether they trample on politically defenseless minorities or not. For both the nominees, they believe they defer to the political process, which is whoever is in power, I suppose. Unfortunately, Gilmore writes, nearly everyone is laboring under a delusion that the president, and only the president, can choose the ideology of a judicial nominee. Everyone knows, for example, that the Reagan administration carefully picks judges to suit its ideological taste. But when any senator appears to object to that taste, Reagan cries foul. And many senators say Reagan is right. When they oppose a nominee, they insist it's not because of his ideology, but his competence. I am sorry, Gilmore writes, but on this matter, almost everyone is wrong. There is no warrant in law or logic for saying that a president can pick a judge because of his judicial philosophy, but that the Senate cannot. About judicial nominations, Article 2 of the Constitution says only that the president shall nominate, and by and with advice and consent of the Senate shall appoint judges of the Supreme Court. The Constitution is utterly silent on the criteria the President or the Senate may or may not use when nominating or confirming judges. The Constitution does make the executive, legislative, and judicial branches co-equal. That means, for example, there is no constitutional reason to give the President any more power over judicial appointments than the Senate. On the contrary, the President and the Senate have equal power in that each has to say yes to the nominee to make it an appointment. The equality of the presidential and senatorial appointment power is confirmed by the history of the drafting of the Constitution. The delegates to the Constitutional Convention disagreed on whether the President or Senate would make a better appointment. So instead of giving the appointment power to one or the other, they gave it to both. In fact, at least a few delegates thought this compromise was ideal, because it gave the Senate a check on the president. The co-equality of the judiciary also makes it impossible to argue that a president has a right to choose a judge, and it's the same as his right to choose, say, a cabinet secretary or an ambassador. Nearly everyone agrees that a president has a right to have his own people running the executive branch, because the president is, according to the Constitution, in charge of that branch. But the president is not in charge of the judiciary, and any claim that a president has a right to appoint his judges is pure smoke. As I say, I've seen other articles on this subject, and people say, well, if Ronald Reagan is a conservative, he has a right to have a conservative in office, but does not have a right to have a conservative who wants the Constitution erased, who wants martial law, who works with dirty tricks and money for foul activities to hamper other people's prospects or to sabotage information about himself that would be available to other people and hurt those people. And one I'm thinking in particular is Senator Ed Muskie, and I'll get to that in a few moments. Now, in 1964, there were a lot of articles on nationwide police spying in the 60s, and it was documented after court orders on the Red Squad in Chicago and in 33 states and in New York City, Yonkers, New Rochelle, Nassau, Suffolk County, Buffalo, Ithaca, New York State Police, the Civil Service, National Goals Corporation, and so forth. Now, these groups of Red Squads were linked to Tony Lasowitz. He was involved at Chappaquiddick. He was there the night of the accident when Mary Jo Kopechne was drowned. These involved the Red Squads literally in California when Reagan was governor, and when Rehnquist was, when he was working for the government from 1969 to 71. This activity was still going on, and he was the legal advisor. There was an article that came out on the Chicago Red Squads, written by Barbara Blumenthal. There was a suit filed to ban political spying of Chicago police in 33 states. Again, these suits get quieted down. In 1977, a federal judge ordered the police department to turn over their files and agencies of 26 states, 17 public and private agencies that were spied upon. And the important thing, again, is that the time period for these particular spying operations went up to 1971 and started in the 60s. The files run from 1964 to 1975, when the Red Squad, a unit of the department's intelligence division, was then disbanded in 1975. But Justice Rehnquist was chief legal advisor from 1969 to 1971, where the White House had hired Tony Laswitz and G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt to work. Laswitz was a very important part of the operations in the White House and the Squad 19 that Louis Tackwood was talking about in 1971. And all of this was the time when Rehnquist was the legal advisor, chief legal advisor to the president, President Nixon, and to John Mitchell, and Robert Martin, and G. Gordon Liddy, and so forth. He served in the Justice Department as their legal advisor when the spying was going on. They spied illegally the government and the Pentagon, the CIA, the FBI, on civil rights groups, anti-war groups, mainstream groups such as League of Women Voters, and there were a large list, I think 150 organizations that were listed in the ACLU suit against the Western goals that has not gone to trial of taking away people's rights that involve the military and surreptitiously taking information about people and then putting it into the computers, and $100,000 computer in the basement of Detective Paul. And of course, that article I wrote on Larry Flynt on why he was murdered had to do for Larry Flynt on Larry McDonald, Representative Larry McDonald, of the also president of the Birch Society. The article I wrote in 1983 had to do October 83. It was published. I wrote it in 83. It was published in February of 84 in Hustler. It took 2 months for the legal department, or 3, to actually clear it. There were so many names in that suit. But everything that I wrote in that matter has to do with time periods that involve William Rehnquist working for the Justice Department. And these files were going not only to Western goals, but to the military, to people like John Singlaub, who's now a defendant in the suit placed by CHRISTIC Institute, part of Western goals, the late Roy Cohn, who just died of AIDS last week, and Admiral Thomas Moore, and the very highest of the Pentagon. This information was going to the Pentagon and to the John Birch Society and other organizations for dirty tricks. And this material, as I say, was being accumulated and put into computers. And while Mr. Rehnquist, William Rehnquist, was working for Richard Nixon, he was part of the legal advice of people that were doing illegal activities. And now he should be promoted to become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. There's an article out of the Houston Post, December 6, 1984, on the Houston Police Department working. It was one of more than 100 agencies that traded information with Chicago Red Squad and their involvement in Houston, Texas. And, of course, the major cities all over America were involved with this Red Squad activity that continued on and stopped in 1977 when Rehnquist was still in charge of the legal department as this information was filing into Washington, into the FBI. J. Edgar Hoover didn't die until May of 72, but the FBI was heavily involved in blackmail and in crimes in the COINTEL program, in the Operation Chaos program, and William Rehnquist was very much in the middle of that in Washington, D.C., when he was made a judge on the Supreme Court. The Watergate story hadn't yet broken out around the country. There are quite a few articles from December 1984. If you go to your library and look them up, December the 6th on the 60s Police Spy Network covered the entire United States. That's one from the San Jose Mercury, December the 6th, 1984. The same December 6th, 84, Los Angeles Times. California agencies got dossiers on non-criminal groups from the Chicago police, and these were spread around all the states of the Union. They said 33, but with computers, it could go much faster, and I'm sure a lot of people are aware of the computers that the Aryan nations have, run by Richard Butler, who worked at Lockheed on the U-2 program in Burbank, and then became a minister up in Hayden Lake, Idaho, where he wants to separate the whites from blacks in the United States, and is part of a plan to kill all blacks and Jews in the United States, and they're quite overt about that. So Rehnquist had an active part in that. Now, the physical condition of Rehnquist is very interesting. Many of you might be reading the material about his doctor and the care that he got and the hypnosis drugs he got right after he became a justice of the Supreme Court. Now, I did a program on the suicide of Senator East a few weeks ago, and since then there's been some other material that came out. His suicide note wasn't made available for several weeks, and it's perfectly obvious that the reason the suicide note was hidden for so long, his death was described in the newspapers at June 28th, 1986, that time period. But it took 1 month to tell about the suicide note because the doctor he blames for his death is the doctor that was drugging William Rehnquist with hypnosis drugs 3 times the normal dose and more frequently for a longer period of time, 3 times longer than the period of time, till he actually had a drug dependency. And that is a very nice hook to put on a justice of the Supreme Court who from then on will, if he didn't it before, be dancing to your tunes. The article from the LA Times, Senator John East, a wheelchair-bound polio victim, prided himself on his mental acumen. He wrote a note before killing himself. He blamed his doctor. He blamed Bethesda Naval Hospital and Dr. Freeman H. Carey, the attending physician of Congress, who failed to detect his thyroid disease, which sapped his energy and gave him the wrong medications, which led to a near-fatal coma last year, which affected and ruined his health. And because of this terrible condition, he didn't want to live any longer. Carey, a rear admiral in the Navy Reserves, was one of the doctors who treated East for his thyroid condition that was diagnosed after he went into a coma. And Carey was released from his post that he had for 13 years, 1 month after East died. Then the articles began about Rehnquist had drug dependency. And it tells about his dependency of a hypnotic drug from 1977 to 1981 that he was given, even before 1971 was when he was nominated to the court, so it's while he was on the court, 1977 to 1981, frequently using a 3-month prescription in a single month. Dr. Freeman Carey, the Capitol physician who prescribed the drug Placidil for the Chief Justice designate, told the FBI that he warned Rehnquist on occasion about exceeding the recommended dosage. Dr. William Poland, former director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, was not allowed to talk to Rehnquist, and he wasn't allowed to talk to Carey or the pharmacist at the Capitol who filled the prescription. He based his studies primarily on Rehnquist's medical records for Congress and didn't go into the mental records. Carey, the sources say, Dr. Carey began prescribing Placidil for Rehnquist in 1971 to help him sleep despite severe back pains. But this isn't a sleeping pill. The report told the FBI that Rehnquist had taken it before, I guess before Dr. Carey prescribed it, probably before he was even on the bench. According to the authoritative physician's desk reference, prolonged use of the drug may result in intolerance and psychological and physical dependence. The usual adult dosage of Placidil is 500 milligrams, taken orally at bedtime. Rehnquist was consuming 1,500 milligrams, running a 3-month prescription to a 1-month time and packing those into his body. And they're described as hypnosis drugs, and that he was dependent upon them. And then he was put into the hospital and had to have treatment for withdrawing. The Los Angeles Times had a story August 12th from the Washington Post. A repeat Carey, a cardiologist, joined the office of the attending physicians in 1972 and became head of the office in 1973. The office, established in 1928, treats members of Congress, their families, staffs, pages, Capitol Police, provides emergency treatment for tourists. Supreme Court justices are all entitled to free medical care. And so this poor Rehnquist, I don't know what his mind was before, and Senator East had the same physician, East, blaming him for the reason for his death. And at the same time, we're getting a man nominated as the head of the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice, who is taking this kind of medication and has been under hypnosis drugs and has taken large amounts of the medication. And goodness knows what happened to him in this interim, or who was in touch with him, because they describe it as a hypnotic drug. The San Francisco Chronicle said that Dr. Freeman H. Carey Until recently, attending physician for Congress had prescribed these drugs, and Rehnquist was at George Washington Hospital in 1981 to help him withdraw from the drug. He had disturbances in mental clarity and had to withdraw, and evidently has deep problems. The drug has nothing to do with the pain in his back, but it is, as I say, is described as a hypnotic drug and makes you sleep, but it also is a hypnotic drug. We'll take a 1-minute break and go back, or continue. Go back to the story of William Rehnquist and some very important information about him and his nomination as the future Justice of the Supreme Court. This is Mae Brussell, and this is the second half of a 1-hour program called World Watchers. In case you just tuned in, is program number 767. On my broadcast, number 767 weeks ago, I talked about the death of Senator East, and I mentioned that East's last appointment in Washington was the Friday afternoon visit when he met at the Hart Building office with Judge Antonin Scalia to discuss Scalia's nomination to the Supreme Court. East, a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, would have voted on the nomination. Now, Judge Scalia is visiting with Senator East, who is under a strained mental state. He's going to commit suicide and blame a specific doctor for the reason for his mental problems and his desire not to live any longer. And Justice Rehnquist, who's being promoted to Chief Justice at the same time Scalia is getting his nomination to be on the Supreme Court, had the same doctor who was giving him drugs for a dependency upon the drugs and a hypnotic drug to boot that was not for his back, but evidently or in some way could possibly affect his mind. Now, Senator Orrin Hatch of Utah put down the health problems of William Rehnquist. He says this is the overreaction of people that want to hurt his chances. But it seems that people want a certain appointment. They don't give credit that the opposition ever has a logical reason for stating their opinion on the matter. Incidentally, the Select Committee to Study Governmental Operations with respect to intelligence activities in 1976 was headed by Frank Church, and on the committee was Philip Hart of Michigan. Now, Frank Church, shortly after these hearings where he was putting the CIA in the carpet and the mind control programs and the COINTEL programs, the Operation Chaos, and all that spying activity that was happening while Rehnquist was chief advisor from 1969 to 71, whoever Frank Church's doctor was, and it'd be interesting to look at the medical records, he very shortly after that proceeded to have cancer and died of cancer. The other person on this committee who died of cancer was Philip Hart of Michigan, described as the conscience of the Senate. These two men were very decent people, and they died of cancer shortly after this. Along with that, Hubert Humphrey, presidential candidate that knew all the ins and outs of Washington, D.C., died of cancer. Adlai Stevenson was poisoned by the CIA. And, of course, Leo Ryan of the CIA, who had a bill controlling activities of the CIA, was shot down in Guyana, part of the Jonestown CIA operation. And 4 peacekeepers of the United Nations were killed. Dag Hammarskjöld in an airplane crash. Ralph Bunche flying out a window in New York City, similar to Mr. Olson with his CIA drugs. Olof Palme, who was murdered in Sweden, and that isn't solved yet, but is linked to the DINA, to our CIA, and the intelligence operations we put into power in Chile, and Adlai Stevenson, as I say, who was poisoned. So 4 peacekeepers from the UN have died. But thinking of the doctor in Washington, D.C., or the doctors that take care of Congress, and I wonder about Stevenson's cancer, not Stevenson, but Hubert Humphrey cancer, and the cancer of Philip Hart, and also of Frank Church, who were the most active people on the Senate Committee to Study Governmental Operations. Now, the new book came out just recently. It's not new, Secret Agenda. It's written by Jim Hogan. It's about Watergate, published by Random House, 1984. And I'm going to refer to that book quite a bit because of the Lewis Tackwood allegations and the role of Rehnquist in this whole milieu of the martial law plan. But in this book, on page 264, they're describing the activities after the Watergate story and the process of covering it up. and he describes Robert Bennett's office. Robert Bennett ran Mullen Company across the street from the White House. Robert Bennett was Howard Hunt's boss at Mullen & Company. On July the 10th, less than 1 month after the Watergate arrests, and this is very important, they arrested in June. On July 10th, less than a month after the Watergate arrests, Robert Bennett met with the CIA case officer Martin Lukowski in a downtown Washington cafeteria. At that meeting, memorialized by Lukowski in a handwritten memorandum of such sensitivity that he hand-carried it to CIA Director Richard Helms, formerly the OSS with William Casey and William Donovan, Bennett bragged that he had dissuaded the reporters from the Washington Post and the Washington Star from pursuing a 7 days in May scenario, implicating the CIA in a Watergate conspiracy. And Mr. Bennett related he had now established a backdoor entry to Edward Bennett Williams' law office, the firm representing the Democratic Party. And, of course, that law office represented John Hinckley when he shot Ronald Reagan in front of the Hilton Hotel in Washington. But to get back to this, they dissuaded the 7 day in May scenario 1 month after the Watergate arrest. And I was writing Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped? Starting in June and had finished it by the end of July. It took about 6 weeks to write. It was about the 7 day in May plan, the Hunt and McCord, White and Martin, the Lewis Tackwood allegations, and Mr. Jim Hogan, who wrote Spooks, refers to the way that story was killed. So if the story was killed, then it had to exist. You can't kill something that didn't exist. And the 7 days in May scenario existed. Now, in Washington, D.C., with the judiciary, there was a little conflict over subpoenaing papers of William Rehnquist, and that was passed over very quickly. It remains whether the full House or Senate that vote on Rehnquist, how many will vote. I hope all of them do when they get back, will pay attention to these papers. The New York Times had a story, Clash in Capitol on Rehnquist data reported growing. Then another article, Washington Post, August the 7th, Rehnquist not in danger over papers. Senator Mathias finds nothing dramatic. Now, Senator Mathias is from Maryland. Senator Mathias is the senator who coaxed the government and Richard Nixon to give Fort Detrick, Maryland, the Fort Detrick laboratories where chemical biological warfare was created in those labs, turned it over to Litton Industries, part of the intelligence community, and that is where the virus AIDS was created. For all practical purposes, there hasn't been any other origin greater than the AIDS virus created at Fort Detrick, described in a higher form of killing. I've had it on other broadcasts. The Washington Post had a long article, Democrats seek to subpoena papers. Now, whether they will or won't is very important to the future of this United States, and I mean that very seriously. They should subpoena those papers. They have to do with memorandum, that correspondence and other material that Rehnquist received, prepared, initialed, or had his staff prepare at the Justice Department. Documents such as civil rights, civil liberties, executive privilege, national security, domestic surveillance, anti-war demonstrations, wiretapping, leak investigations, and the May 1970 killing of Kent State. Incidentally, the memorial that I described on one program that they were going to put at Kent State, I read last week, was turned down because the families wanted the names of the 4 students killed etched into there, similar to the Vietnam Memorial. So that was turned down, and they're getting a new architect and start all over because they don't want those 4 people remembered. That was in the news this week. The New York Times, August the 8th, has a story indexed to unreleased department documents, and it has memos of civil emergency, and these are the Rehnquist papers they're asking for. One is the Laird versus Tatum, January the 3rd, March the 25th, 1969, to the Attorney General, having to do with civil emergency, planning and coordinating emergency suggestions for federal troops by the President, Another is December the 14th, 1970, a memo to Mr. Kleindienst, proposed Department of Defense relating to civil disturbances, and this has to do with General Exton, and a letter and directives about federal troops to come and control civil disturbances, and that leads up to the Lewis-Tackwood allegations, which take place a year later when Squad 19 was formed, of course. Another section they want on reform of the classification system of leaks. July 24th, 1969, memos from the Internal Security Division how to transmit unclassified strategic information. Unclassified, it's already a secret. How to amend the espionage laws to allow President Nixon to reclassify information as vital to national security. Remember, that's how he had tried to hold up the Watergate papers and prevent its release. The broad language would be made even broader to lock up a lot of these memos. July 8th, 1971, a memo to John Dean, Interdepartmental Security Committee. The memo discusses executive orders dealing with access to classified information, and this has to do with locking up information preceding the martial law plan that was being set for 1971 at home in the United States that Tackwood talked about. The committee, Washington Post says the committee wants the August 26, 1971 letter to John Mitchell from Senator Kennedy. The letter confirms a request to investigate why there was no grand jury called for the Kent State killings, and it goes into judicial nominations. And the Washington Post article is long. I'll read it to you maybe on another program and outline it for you, but that's the gist of what should be in the hands of people before they vote. And remember, the Senate or the House has as much, particularly the Senate, as much right to decide on a justice as the President of the United States. Now, I want to just share with you from the Watergate hearing some very important material before the time runs out, and I can get back to some of the Rehnquist stories later. William Rehnquist is mentioned 3 times in the index of the Watergate hearings. The first time is in Volume 2, Book 2, Hearings Before the Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities of the United States Senate, 93rd Congress. And this is Book 2 of the Watergate hearings from the U.S. Government Printing Office, printed in 1973. The hearings were taking place in 1973. The question came in about spying on Senator Muskie. You remember Ed Muskie was given LSD and drugged and made to appear incoherent by the Watergate team so that he wouldn't be a candidate against Richard Nixon. But there was something else going on. Lowell Weicker said, which senator is this? Because they're referring to their various spying. Senator Muskie. He could be used as a great front to go to California and hold tax hearings, and it would be a great event for Muskie running against Richard Nixon. So Mr. Magruder, Jeb Magruder, who is now a minister, sent copies of what Senator Muskie was going to do to print in Evans and Novak. That's the Robert Novak of Crossfire, and also talk programs on Sunday. He saturates the air, as does Mr. Evans. Miss Duncan, their secretary, typed up what Ed Muskie was going to do in California with tax matters and gave it to Evans and Novak, and they printed it. All right, Lowell Weicker said. And there were other documents or instances where Miss Duncan performed services relative to Mr. Porter. Yes, sir, Miss Duncan, on one occasion, she took Senator Muskie's speech. He was going to deliver to the Senate against the nomination of William Rehnquist to the Supreme Court. It was on film, and specifically it was 20 pages. And I asked Jeb Magruder what he wanted me to do with it. And he said, let me check, and he checked, and he got back to me, and he said, Mr. Mitchell would like it. Now, William Rehnquist was the legal advisor for the Justice Department over John Mitchell. And what they wanted from Ed Muskie was the 20 pages against William Rehnquist when he was nominated to be a judge, not the justice of the Supreme Court. I would like you to write to members of the Senate and the House, Senator Metzenbaum, Senator Biden, anybody who's listening, move your pen and get active, get off your butt, just like I went out on a limb and fought AGS out there in Monterey. And we'll read to you again what I handed out at that hearing and how it affected, I believe, was the turning point of their scamming out of town and not wanting to come back. But what I'm saying is write and ask, and write to Senator Muskie, Senator Biden, Senator Metzenbaum, before he is confirmed as the Chief Justice, we want the 20 pages, the 20-page reason why Rehnquist shouldn't be a justice and why John Mitchell, the Attorney General, had photocopied this paper, and then they began the harassing of Ed Muskie and gave him LSD to make him appear incoherent. Now, this same testimony in Volume 2 of the hearings, the secretary said it had to be completely typed, and she read it. Senator Lowell Weicker said, I'm supposed that you did go through this whole thing and read it. And it was put into an IBM dictaphone, and Miss Duncan typed it. And Weicker said, Miss Duncan is now your secretary. That's Mr. Porter testifying, yes, sir. At any time, did you send Miss Duncan to the White House to give Gordon Strom copies of the photographed documents of transcripts of why Muskie should not be on the Supreme Court? I don't remember whether I did or not. I don't remember. It's possible I did. If I could, if I did, it would have been because Mr. Magruder would have said this and wanted a copy, and Gordon Strom. And it went over to the hands of the Attorney General, John Mitchell. As I say, William Rehnquist was the person mentioned in the papers. Mr. Porter said, I will tell it as I remember. Let me say this. If Miss Duncan says that's what happened, it did happen. I don't want to dispute what she said. On the other hand, the reason I would also send a document to Strom would be Magruder's suggestion. I do remember sending. I believe there was a copy of the Rehnquist speech put together, 20 pages, on why William Rehnquist should not be Justice of the Supreme Court, and that also appeared. It was sent to Evans and Novak that he wrote this speech. Weicker, you realize at the time that these documents were obtained illegally, that it was illegal to take them, and he confirms, well, he didn't think it was illegal, but they were intercepting the mail. That's a violation of the law. I knew the intercepting of mail would be a violation. I put the photographing of the documents in the same category. It was surreptitious, yes, sir, and so forth. And the Volume 2 goes into taking the papers and photographing them of what reasons Muskie had against Rehnquist. Now, Book 11 of the same series, the Watergate hearings, Volume 11, Book 11, hearings before the Select Committee on the Presidential Campaign Activities, they pursued this some more. And I'm going to read the 2 pages that refer to Muskie and then the milieu under which William Rehnquist was working. And that material I had on the air once before, but not in the context that the legal advisor for John Mitchell would soon be Justice of the Supreme Court. Now, in Volume 11, the subject comes up again, and a Mr. Buckley is testifying. He's from the FBI. He's doing these dirty tricks. He works for government offices. I'll read you his background and testimony. And he is one of the masters of dirty tricks, even though he is a federal agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigations. Now, Mr. Edmondson is asking him a question. Mr. Buckley, let's go back to these boxes that you received from Mr. Wyatt. These are letters. You saw these releases. Yes, you saw the drafts of letters. Buckley says they were not signed. They were not stamped. And Edmondson said, well, it could have been a draft, a letter prepared waiting for Senator Muskie's signature. It is possible. Did you see letters coming to Muskie from contributors? No. Did you see drafts of his speeches? There were drafts that could conceivably be speeches or position papers. Well, you read them, didn't you? That was your purpose. I glanced through them. How did you know? What were you giving them if you didn't read it? I did say I glanced through them if it pertained to his itinerary, his position on an issue that I considered an issue to be relevant. I photographed it. That was your criteria? In other words, you had to read every document in the box to choose. I would not be argumentative, he said. I would take a glance. Have you come up with any evidence of material that ever appeared in newspapers that you have collected that had to do with his particular leaks on what these people were going to say? He said, the only situation I respond to is that it was publicized that a Senator Muskie memo was forwarded to Evans and Novak and put in their column. I don't recall seeing the memo, but I recall the instance in late 1971, and he tells about that, how the memo that he had was passed on. That was the tax matter. Edmondson said, well, now, do you ever recall looking at any paper prepared by Senator Muskie relating to the nomination of William Rehnquist? Yes, sir. I recall that draft. It was a draft. It was double-spaced. You photographed it, didn't you? I photographed it. Now, Mr. Buckley, you are an experienced man. You worked for the government a long time. I'm sure you're familiar with the Hatch Act, are you not? I'm familiar with it. Did you read it before engaging in the activity? I have read it. It was my feeling that the Hatch Act spells activities which are prohibited and activities that are permitted. And in this area, I didn't feel the Hatch Act applied. Edmondson recalled to him, he said, it is unlawful for any person employed in an administrative position in the United States or by any department or independent agency in the United States to use his official authority for the purpose of interfering or affecting the election or nomination of a candidate. And he said, I emphasize the word affecting. And Buckley said, affected or interfered with, whatever interpretation you make. And Edmondson said, if you look back over your activities, Mr. Buckley, do you think your activities were a waste of time? He said, I didn't hear your question. Your activities, for the purpose you began, did they not affect the campaign of Muskie? And he said, not as far as I'm concerned, in terms of his not getting the nomination. If we were successful, I would not have felt the time was wasted if he had won the nomination. But the point is that Ed Muskie was not, he was given the asset. I don't know if any other person running against Richard Nixon was given the LSD. But the point was that he was given that, and following him was not just so much being a candidate, but that he didn't want Rehnquist nominated, and Rehnquist's name comes into the picture. Now, the material that precedes that, leading up to the Muskie papers on Rehnquist, has to do with the hearings of the committee in questioning Mr. Buckley and his activities in spying in Washington, D.C., and carrying on. This is, as I say, it's called the Foreign and Military Intelligence Final Report of the Select Committee to Study Governmental Operations. And this area goes into the people that were working to spy and administer the LSD that Muskie got. In this particular book, this separate document from the Watergate hearings, these are the military intelligence, which again involves Squad 19 and the Defense Department. This volume tells you on page 401 on the use of LSD and local physicians to force hallucinations, that the CIA project involves surreptitious administration of LSD, that they could affect human behavior and test human behavior so that doctors couldn't diagnose it, and they could get them to appear not sensible or medically dangerous. The LSD was potentially dangerous, but the purpose of it was to affect their behavior. On page 406, it tells about the agencies administering LSD to unwitting, non-volunteer human subjects in coordination with the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, the same activities, agencies that the president wants to use now, with the military going into countries to stop their drug production, and the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs was administering LSD to people like Senator Ed Muskie, who not only didn't run for president against Richard Nixon because his behavior was seeming to be so irresponsible, and he actually had been given this LSD that the CIA had made, but he also had information on William Rehnquist, and it's very important that we see it now. Now, a few years ago, I had some of these characters. I described the people that were working in this milieu on the air, but in the context of the spying on Muskie because of Rehnquist, I'm just going to read again a few sections of the Senate committee investigating Watergate that had to do with Robert Bentz, one of the witnesses, and I'll quickly just run down part of it, and some of you will remember, because Mr. Bentz worked with Mr. Buckley, and they were protecting William Rehnquist from not having to be exposed by a speech by a particular senator. I don't know why Muskie was the only one, evidently, who was opposing him. Maybe others were, and we don't know what happened to them. Mr. Robert Bentz was questioned before the committee. This is page 4403 of the Senate Watergate hearings, and Senator Sam Ervin was the chairman in charge of that. Mr. Bentz said he's a dock superintendent. He had political experience prior to the elections in 1972. He was president of the Young Republicans. He worked with Donald Segretti, who hired him for dirty tricks. He was hired to obtain hecklers and pickets to get people to infiltrate the campaigns, and that goes back to the Tackwood Allegations. And their strategy was to concentrate on Hubert Humphrey, who died of cancer, Senator Muskie, who was given LSD and drugged, and Senator Jackson, who died at the same night that Larry McDonald was deep sixed. Senator Jackson died in Seattle very quietly and not under too much notice of an apparent heart attack. These hearings go on to say that Senator Muskie was one of the main recipients of their spying. They joined the Muskie camp. The Muskie people were followed wherever they went, and they continued to have field activities for Richard Nixon and dirty tricks for Donald Segretti with instructions and money, and pickets were to be at rallies where Nixon attended to make the left appear not appreciating Richard Nixon and to look like hoodlums. There were placards that said, if you love Hitler, you'll just love Wallace. A vote for Wallace is wasted. And March 14th, it said, cast your vote for Senator Edmund Muskie. Help Muskie support busing your children. And the signs were against, again, Jackson and Humphrey, both dead. Senator Frank Church, dead. It's time somebody began to add up the death squads in this country. Then it tells about going to the headquarters of Senator Muskie, and one of the things they did, Mr. Bence, going to the headquarters of Muskie, was that they would get chemicals. It said they had to throw or do whatever they had to do with the chemical. Bence said, well, in one building there was a hole in the window, which they dropped substance in the window. In another building, it was told the screen was open, the window was open, and they dropped it in. They didn't tell you they removed the screen. That is correct. What did Mr. Herring do with the other chemical? They took it to a picnic. It was a Senator Muskie picnic. They emptied the vial at the picnic. Where was the picnic held? On the grounds of Mary Help of Christians Church School. You and Donald Segretti observed the picnic, did you not? No. You were not in the area, not at that time. And it tells about the payment for flipping chemicals in windows. Getting back to the picnic where the chemical was distributed. Do you recall telling the FBI who interviewed you in May of this year and you drove down to the Muskie picnic and noticed the chemical had been distributed? That is correct. Did you? Then he asked again, did you go to the picnic? I went to one picnic. I did go to the picnic area. I didn't go to the picnic, as I said before. Mr. Bence said he thought he mentioned that I might possibly be needed to travel to the conventions to join in demonstrations, that they would be hiring other people for that purpose. Part would be for the Muskie campaign. Donald Segretti was hiring them and sending them out in Miami, and the original plan was in San Diego, the martial law plan. And again, this is all under the influence and control of the Justice Department of John Mitchell, Jeb Magruder, and their superior in this case was William Rehnquist. Mr. Bence, he said, now you circulated a report that the candidate for president was guilty of homosexual activities. That is true. Are you proud of your achievement? No. And Senator Sam Ervin begins to ask the questions, how do you feel about that? Senator Talmadge, you had two subordinates. One was Mr. Duke, and I've shared this with listeners before, but it may be new for other people. Yes, that's right, Duke and Mr. Herring. Did Mr. Herring tell you that Duke was a former SS officer for Adolf Hitler's stormtroopers? Correct. Senator Talmadge, did you feel that being trained by Adolf Hitler in his stormtroopers particularly qualified him for the duties that you assigned him to? Mr. Bence, I don't know anything about training that would have trained him for this work. Senator Talmadge, were the activities similar? Didn't Hitler's Nazi stormtroopers perform similar activities to what you were engaged in Florida? I don't know, sir. You haven't read history of that period? You haven't read The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, I take it? Are not the activities of Nazi stormtroopers similar? I don't recall if he ever read it, and I didn't. Senator Talmadge, well, I think they're similar. I read a good many of the falsified documents during that era and the libels and slander about the opposition. It was one of the ways, as I recall, that Adolf Hitler achieved power. Now, Robert Mardian was down in the National Archives with G. Gordon Liddy, watching the pictures of Adolf Hitler and Hitler's SS Gestapo. They hired agents of the SS Gestapo to help them in Miami to create the milieu for the riots that would take place to round up all the radicals, similar to the Reichstag operation in Germany. William Rehnquist was in the Justice Department as the advisor through this period when they were setting up the martial law plan. He was there through the whole Red Squad activities, which didn't end until 1977. Even during Watergate, exposures of the Cohn teleprogram, the Operation Chaos, he was working with Tony Laswitz of the Red Squads, involved in some way at Chippequiddick. We still don't know the role of who killed Mary Jo Kopechne, and I don't believe Ted Kennedy drove that car that night. There's nobody who saw him wet or can prove that he drove it, but his reasons for silence are something else we can discuss. But the point is that William Rehnquist is going to be the Justice of the Supreme Court. The hearings will take place in 3 weeks, and I beg you, you don't have many chances left. There were chances that came by the way in Germany, along the way, and people did not read Mein Kampf, as I stated before. They sat on their hands. They were unable to act. William Rehnquist is a menace because he was a legal advisor through this horrendous period. And I beg you to write to the senators, write to members of the House of Representatives, send night letters, send copies of this broadcast. If you didn't tape it off the air, write to me and you can get a copy. If you taped it, get the bibliography sheets with this information. And let's see what we can do with Rehnquist. Let's chase him out of the Chief Justice job like we chased advanced genetic sciences out of Monterey County and maybe out of the potato fields up in Tulare, Northern California, and maybe off planet Earth. Maybe they won't be able to put their live bacteria on the Earth. It's the same people, the same chemical companies that put Hitler into power. So help now to do something to get Rehnquist out, and I'll do more about him next week and maybe the week after if necessary to continue what he was involved in, and don't let him be a justice of the Supreme Court. This is Mae Brussell. I'll be back with you next week. Now you write your letters and make your calls and let me know. Send me copies of those letters so I see how you do. That way we'll do our homework. Thanks a lot, and I'll be back with you next week.